Scientists have just published a finding they were never meant to release, and if your family traces back to the mountains of Kurdistan, everything you thought you knew about your ancestors is about to unravel. But this isn't just a footnote in some obscure journal, because what you're about to hear exposes the genetic cover-up that's been hiding in plain sight for 10,000 years. For decades, the story of the Kurds has been written by empires, by conquerors, by neighbors who dismiss them as a people without a past, a scattered population with no ancient claim to the land they've defended for thousands of years. But now, a quiet revolution in genetics, one that certain institutions would have preferred stayed locked in a laboratory, is rewriting that narrative from the ground up. The DNA of the Kurdish people has been compared to every ancient civilization you can think of: the first farmers of the Fertile Crescent, the mysterious cave dwellers of the Zagros Mountains, Bronze Age merchants on the Mediterranean coast, even the horse-riding herders from the Eurasian steppe. And the result? It didn't just surprise the researchers. It shocked them into silence, because what they found proves that the Kurds are not newcomers to the Middle East. They are not the product of recent migrations. They are, in a genetic sense, the ghost of an ancient world made flesh, carrying a lineage so deep, so persistent, that it tears down entire textbooks of Near Eastern history. If you have Kurdish blood, or if you've ever wondered who was really there at the dawn of civilization, keep watching. Because the next 60 seconds reveal the DNA bombshell that demolishes everything you were taught, and the truth at the end will force you to question who really wrote the history books. Think back to what you were told about Kurdish origins. The traditional story, the one passed down through generations, the one taught in schools, the one echoed by politicians across several modern nations, was always a tale of fragmentation. A people without a clear genetic signature, without a single founding ancestor, without a biological thread tying them to any mighty ancient civilization. Historians pointed to the Kurdish language, an Indo-European tongue related to Persian, and assumed the Kurds must have arrived as part of some late, chaotic migration from Central Asia, maybe with the Medes, maybe later, always an echo of a larger empire rather than a root population in their own right. Others pointed to the dizzying diversity of Kurdish tribes and suggested a melting pot of leftovers. Some Persians, some Arabs, some Turks, some Armenians, all mixed together over centuries into a new identity that was cultural, not genetic. The story we were told was that the Kurds are a young people, a medieval or even modern creation, with no ancient homeland, no ancient DNA, and no ancient right. Every nation that has ever wanted to deny Kurdish autonomy has leaned on this story. It's a biological erasure disguised as history. Imagine the weight of that. Generations hearing that your blood is a hodgepodge of everyone else's discards, that your mountains are just a place you happen to be standing, not the soil that shaped your very cells. And for a long time, there was no hard evidence to fight back with. Only oral epic poems about blacksmith Kawa and the tyrant Zahak. Only folk songs sung in villages on starlit mountainsides. The sound of a duduk drifting through a valley as an elder recounts a lineage he can only trace through words, not yet through molecules. Beautiful, but not science. The story we were told was that genetics would confirm the narrative of disunity, that Kurdish DNA would be a chaotic mosaic, a genetic shrug. So when scientists finally got access to large Kurdish samples, and when they finally held those samples up against the most complete database of ancient genomes ever assembled, no one expected what they saw. The story we were told was wrong, completely, provably, embarrassingly wrong. So what did the scientists actually do? The discovery phase began quietly, in sterile labs and humming sequencing machines, far from the geopolitical noise surrounding the word Kurdistan. Picture a technician pipetting a clear liquid into a vial, the soft whir of a centrifuge, the glow of a screen displaying rows of genetic letters that would soon topple empires of a different sort. Researchers drew blood and swabbed cheeks from hundreds of Kurdish volunteers across multiple countries, from the rugged peaks of southeastern Turkey, from the plains of northern Iraq, from the cities of western Iran, from the scattered communities in Syria. They extracted the DNA, purified it, and began looking for two types of genetic markers: Y-DNA, which is passed strictly from father to son down the male line, a sort of surname written in the genome, and mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, which passes from mother to child and preserves the equally deep female lineage. Each one of these markers is a time capsule, an unbroken chain stretching from a living person back to a single man or woman who lived in a specific place thousands or even tens of thousands of years ago. Think of it as an invisible thread connecting a modern man in Erbil to a hunter pacing the same hills when glaciers still covered northern Europe. And what the scientists found in those Kurdish Y chromosomes stopped them cold. The dominant lineage was J2A, specifically a sub-branch called J2A-M410. In some Kurdish populations, more than a quarter of all men carry this marker. In others, even higher. Now, J2A is not some random pan-Middle Eastern signature. It has a very specific origin story. It first appeared in the northern arc of the Fertile Crescent, exactly where the Zagros Mountains drop into the Mesopotamian plain, during a time when the climate was warming after the Ice Age, and humans were doing something they had never done before: planting wheat, domesticating goats, building permanent houses from mud, brick, and stone. Can you imagine the first moment a human deliberately pressed a seed into the earth and trusted it would return? J2A is the signature of that Neolithic revolution itself, the marker of the very first people on Earth who figured out how to farm and settled down to create the earliest villages that would eventually explode into the cities of Sumer, Babylon, and beyond. And here it was, in modern Kurds, in staggering frequency. This was not a faint echo. This was a dominant signal. The scientists knew they had opened a door that certain historical narratives had kept firmly shut. But this was just the beginning. They hadn't yet compared the Kurds to the ancient dead. Now it's time to walk through the evidence, piece by piece, because each layer of genetic data the scientists uncovered didn't just add to the picture. It demolished a long-held assumption. Let's start with the mothers. The mitochondrial DNA, the matrilineal line, whispers a story often drowned out by the louder shouts of Y chromosome studies. In Kurdish populations, the most common mtDNA haplogroups are H, U, and J, with a very special emphasis on a rare subclade called U7. H is widespread across West Eurasia, a frequent companion of human migrations for millennia. But U, and especially U7, have a critical story to tell. U7 is a marker of ancient Iranian plateau populations. A landmark study from 2013 in the Annals of Human Biology, led by Quintana Mercy, dove deep into the mitochondrial lineages of the Near East. They traced U7 back to hunter-gatherers and early herders who roamed the region that includes the Zagros Range during and after the last Ice Age, long before any written word, before any empire, before pottery even. Picture a woman wrapped in furs, nursing an infant in the mouth of a cave while the wind howls across a landscape still dotted with patches of snow, her own mother having passed down knowledge of which roots to dig, which paths the wild goats take. That deep maternal memory is encoded in U7. And here's what's so devastating to the old narrative. U7 is notably frequent in modern Kurds. It didn't arrive with the Persians. It's not found in high levels in Arabia. It's not a Turkic import. It is an indigenous maternal signature, a link back to the female population that was already sheltering in the caves and valleys of the Zagros as the world thawed. This means the genetic continuity is not just a male warrior elite scenario, where conquering men impose their Y chromosomes on local women. No. Both the male and female lines in Kurds point back to this same deep, pre-Indo-European, Iran Neolithic world. This is a population that has carried both its father's and its mother's ancient stories in its cells. Now, the male side gets even more specific and more shocking. Researchers didn't just study living Kurds in isolation. They compared them to the actual ancient genomes scraped from bones buried for thousands of years. Bones that had been silent in the earth until modern science gave them a voice. In 2016, the scientific world was rocked by a paper published in Science by Lazaridis and a massive international team. They had managed to extract DNA from some of the earliest farmers on the planet, human remains found in the Zagros Mountains of Iran, dating to between 10,000 and 7,000 years before Christ. These were the very first people to transition from hunting and gathering to a settled agricultural life in this part of the world. The paper was a landmark, a generational leap in our understanding, where the authors detailed the painstaking process of drilling into petrous bones, the densest part of the skull, to extract strands of DNA that had weathered the millennia. The genomes they pulled from those ancient bones revealed Y DNA haplogroups that are instantly recognizable to anyone studying modern Kurds, G2A and J2A. Let that sink in. The men who first domesticated emmer wheat and barley in the shadow of the Zagros peaks, the men who built the circular mud brick homes at sites like Ganj-Dare, their floors worn smooth by bare feet, their hearths still bearing the ash of 10,000-year-old fires. the men whose bones were found with the earliest sickles made of flint, their edges still microscopically glossed from cutting grain stalks. They carried the exact same paternal lineages that dominate the Kurdish population today. This is a direct genetic handshake across 10,000 years. It's not a cousin relationship. It's a grandson to great-grandfather link, repeated in millions of individuals. The scientists weren't looking at a slight similarity. They were looking at robust continuity. If you placed a modern Kurdish man from Duhok next to an ancient Zagros farmer from 8000 BCE in a genetic cluster analysis, they would fall onto the same branch. They are the same people, biologically speaking, separated only by the whisper of time and the modest genetic input that any population absorbs over millennia. How many other modern populations can claim such a direct line to the inventors of farming itself? The evidence deepens when you move into the Bronze Age, a time of seafaring merchants, palatial economies, and the first great trade networks that knitted the ancient world together. A 2017 study in Nature led by Haber analyzed human remains from the ancient coastal city of Sidon in Lebanon, dating to around 1750 BCE, a time when Canaanite culture was flourishing and trade networks connected Egypt to Mesopotamia. Imagine the bustling harbor, the scent of cedarwood and olive oil, ships unloading copper ingots from Cyprus while scribes recorded transactions in cuneiform. The scientists found Y DNA haplogroups J2 and E1b1b in those Bronze Age Levantine merchants and farmers. Once again, these are major Kurdish lineages. E1b1b, while less dominant than J2a among Kurds, is a significant minority paternal line, a signal of ancient Near Eastern populations, stretching back to the Natufian hunter-gatherers who preceded the Neolithic. Those innovative people who, in the hills of the Levant, began the first tentative experiments with sedentism, building stone houses even before they knew how to farm. What this shows is that the Kurds share paternal links with the ancient populations of the Levant, not because the Kurds came from the Levant, but because both populations draw from the same deep well of Neolithic ancestry that spread farming and village life in all directions from a core zone that includes the Kurdish highlands. The Kurds are not a branch on someone else's tree. They are incredibly close to the trunk itself. But what about the later migrations? The Persian conquests, the Arab Islamic expansions, the waves of Turkic nomads from Central Asia, their horses kicking up dust as they moved across the Iranian plateau. The story we were told insisted that the Kurds must be an amalgam of these later overlays, a genetic sponge soaking up whatever blood washed over their mountains. The DNA says no. The evidence from a massive 2018 study published in the journal Cell by Brushaki and colleagues was particularly damning to the old sponge theory. They analyzed ancient genomes from Wezme Cave in Iran, another Zagros site, dating to about 7000 BCE, around the time early herders were moving with their goats through the rocky valleys, the animals bleating echoing off the canyon walls. When they plotted these ancient Wezme genomes on a principal component analysis chart, a genetic map where geography mirrors biology, they found something astonishing. Modern Kurds fell incredibly close to these 9,000-year-old individuals from Wezme Cave. The genetic distance was tiny. On the chart, where populations are plotted as points in a grand constellation of human variation, the Wezme point and the modern Kurdish points nearly overlap, as if time itself had been collapsed. This means the modern Kurdish population cluster tightly with ancient Iranians from the Neolithic period. There has been no massive population replacement. The Mongols did not erase them. The Turks did not swamp them. The Arabs did not genetically transform them. The genetic signal of the ancient Zagros highlanders is so powerful, so resilient, that it persisted as the dominant element of the Kurdish genome through the rise and fall of 100 empires. The mountains did not just protect a language and a culture, they protected a biology. And then there is the steppe question, which deserves a moment of careful attention because it unveils a nuanced but critical part of the Kurdish origin story. In European history, around 3000 BCE, a massive migration from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, what we sometimes call the Yamnaya expansion, swept across the continent, replacing huge chunks of the Neolithic farming population's genetic heritage. This is why many modern Europeans carry high levels of steppe ancestry, visible in Y haplogroups like R1a and R1b, and a specific ancestry component linked to the Caucasus and Eastern hunter-gatherers. The steppe people are also thought to have carried the Indo-European languages, spreading them from Ireland to India, with the wheel, and the domesticated horse. So, what about the Kurds, who speak an Indo-European language today? Did they get overwhelmed by the steppe wave like the Europeans? The answer, shockingly, is no. Kurdish samples do show some steppe-related ancestry, and they do carry some R1b lineages, but the levels are much lower than in most of Europe. It's as if a wave crashed over the highlands, but the bedrock held firm. And critically, the R1b found in Kurds is often of a distinct Middle Eastern subclade, not the classic Western European R1b M269 that exploded with the bell beaker culture. What's more, a deep comparison with ancient Anatolian farmers, published in a 2016 Nature study by Hoffmanova, revealed that Kurds notably lack the very high levels of Anatolian Neolithic ancestry you see in southern Europeans, like Sardinians or Greeks. Instead, Kurds retain overwhelmingly more Iran Neolithic ancestry and what's called CHG, Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry. This CHG component is an ancient lineage from the Caucasus region, isolated in high valleys where glaciers carved the landscape, and it's a fundamental part of the indigenous population that was already in the Zagros and surrounding highlands before the steppe herders ever saddled a horse. So, the Kurdish genetic structure is best described not as a steppe invasion product, but as a base layer of indigenous pre-Indo-European, Iran Neolithic, and CHG, with a later but smaller infusion from the north that likely brought the Indo-European language, possibly through the Caucasus or via an Iranian plateau route around 3000 to 2000 BCE. The body is ancient Zagros. The language is a later overlay. The genetics prove it. So what does all this evidence actually change? The implications of this genetic finding are so profound, so disruptive to the established order of Middle Eastern historiography, that you can understand why this has been a forbidden science, a truth that has taken decades to crawl from the sequencer into the light. The first profound implication is about indigeneity and homeland. For a century, the stateless Kurds have been told they are a people without a land, because they have no ancient roots anywhere. The DNA destroys that argument at the cellular level. The Kurds are not just any ancient people. They are among the most genetically continuous populations in Western Asia, directly descended from the very populations that invented agriculture in that region. When the first domesticated wheat was ever ground, when the first goats were ever penned, the hands that did it belonged to the genetic ancestors of the Kurds. Imagine the coarse texture of that first ground grain between calloused fingers, the bleat of an animal newly dependent on a human family. This is not a nationalist myth. It's a peer-reviewed genetic fact. The Zagros Mountains are not a place the Kurds wandered into. They are the nursery where the Kurdish genome was cradled and shaped. This flips the entire political narrative on its head. It's no longer a question of allowing a minority a seat at the table. It's recognizing that the Kurds built the table, in the literal dawn of settled civilization. The second implication shatters the idea that Kurds are just Persians who moved west. The genetic comparison makes it clear that while Kurds and Persians share some Indo-Iranian connections, the Kurdish gene pool is far more deeply rooted in the pre-Indo-European strata of the Zagros. The Persians, as an ethno-linguistic group, expanded from a different region of the Iranian plateau, likely Fars province, with its sun-baked plains and the ruins of Persepolis, and absorbed different elements along the way. The Kurds, tucked into their mountain fortress with its oak forests and snow-fed streams, preserved a far older signal. This means calling a Kurd an offshoot of a Persian is genetically backwards. If anything, the Kurdish highlands preserve a population type that was widespread across the plateau before the Indo-European migrations solidified into the Persian identity. The Kurds are not a branch. They are the bedrock. The third implication is the most unsettling for the standard narrative of the Islamic and Turkic periods. For generations, it was assumed that the Arabization and Turkification of the Middle East involved massive demographic replacement. Populations were said to be biologically Arabized, their original lineages diluted beyond recognition, like a river swallowed by the sea. The Kurdish DNA proves that this demographic replacement model is often wrong for mountainous regions. While lowland regions of Iraq and Syria saw significant genetic influx from the Arabian Peninsula, visible in the high frequency of Y haplogroup J1 in those areas, the Kurdish highlands resisted. The dominant J2A signal in Kurds is an old, indigenous Near Eastern Neolithic signal, not an Arabian one. Similarly, the Turkic migrations, which left a notable genetic impact in Anatolia, barely dented the Kurdish genome. The Kurds absorbed a new language for commerce or religion. They absorbed some cultural influences, perhaps the taste for a new spice. the pattern on a woven rug, but their core biological identity remained stubbornly, defiantly ancient. This is not an ethnicity forged by Islam. It's an ethnicity that predates Islam by 7,000 years and adopted it as a layer. And the fourth implication forces a rethink of what it means to be a mountain people. The zagros served as a genetic refuge. While armies marched across the plains of Mesopotamia, their shields glinting, their chariot wheels churning the dust, while empires rose and fell in fire and blood, the mountain valleys kept a biological flame burning from the Stone Age. The Kurds are not a relic because they failed to change. They are a relic because they successfully insulated themselves from the constant churn of conquest. Their genetic story is one of survival against incredible odds. A 10,000-year game of hide-and-seek where the prize was their very DNA. Think of the generations who lived and died along those narrow, steep-sided valleys. Their lives invisible to the chroniclers of empires, but their genes a stubborn record. This is why the scientists kept their voices low for a while. In a region where identity claims are a minefield, proving that an ethnic group has this level of ancient continuity, trumping that of their neighbors, is a political superweapon. Now, you don't have to take my word for the strength of this evidence. Let's bring in the voice of the researchers and the papers directly, letting the scholarship speak for itself. The 2015 study by Grugny and colleagues in the European Journal of Human Genetics was one of the first to explicitly state what others had only whispered. They analyzed Y chromosomes across the entire Iranian plateau and the Mesopotamian plain, collecting samples from isolated valleys and bustling cities alike, and concluded that Kurdish groups in different countries, despite centuries of political separation, display a remarkable homogeneity with each other, and that their Y chromosome profiles, dominated by J2A M410, G2A, and R1b, point to a major impact of the Neolithic expansion from the northern Fertile Crescent, rather than any recent admixture. Grugny's work didn't just point to the Neolithic. It practically painted a target on the Zagros, highlighting how the distribution of these lineages in Kurds mirrors the spread of early farming, not the later horse-riding waves. Then, in 2016, Lazaridis and his team in Science gave the ancient proof. In their analysis of 44 ancient Near Easterners, they found that the early Neolithic individuals from Iran were strikingly distinct from early Neolithic people in Anatolia or the Levant. They formed their own genetic cluster, which they dubbed Iran Neolithic, a group whose bones spoke of a unique trajectory, a separate hearth of domestication and settlement. And when they asked which modern populations still carried this distinctive Iran Neolithic signature at the highest levels, the most prominent populations by far were from the same geographic zone: Iranian Zoroastrians, Balochi, and, critically, Kurds. The paper states explicitly that the modern groups from the region harbor substantial ancestry from these early farmers, with limited turnover from subsequent Bronze Age and later migrations. Lazaridis didn't just say the Kurds had some ancient ancestry. He said they retained a substantial proportion of it, implying a continuity so strong it's visible even in the genomic equivalent of broad daylight, a thread running from the earliest agricultural experiments to the present. The Haber team's 2017 paper, which sequenced 5 Bronze Age individuals from Sidon, added another layer to this unfolding picture. They noted that the Canaanite individuals who lived 3,700 years ago had a genetic profile that mixed local Levantine Neolithic ancestry with some Iran Neolithic/CHG ancestry. They then said that modern populations in the region, including those from the Levant and the northern Near East, share this heritage. The Kurds, bearing these same J2 and E1B1b lineages, are a clear living link to that broad Bronze Age Near Eastern world that predates the ethnic and religious divisions of today. It's a genetic map of a time before the names Kurd, Arab, and Jew even meant anything separate, but showing that the Kurdish highlands remained a key reservoir for the ancient components, a deep well that later populations drew from. And the clinching testimony comes from the Brushaki-led cell study on the Wezme cave individual. The study described the cave dweller as carrying the quintessential Iran Neolithic genome. The authors then performed what's called an outgroup F3 statistic test, a high-level genetic comparison that measures shared drift to get a read on deep ancestry. The test showed that modern Kurds, along with a handful of other populations from the Iran-Iraq border region, share the most genetic drift with this Wezme farmer. Brushaki's study concluded that the Neolithic Iran-Caucasus ancestry remains the dominant ancestral component in many modern-day populations in the region. naming Kurds among the primary repositories. These are not words of hedging or mild association. These are words of genetic dominance. The expert corroboration is unanimous and growing louder with every sequenced bone. Let's revisit the key takeaways and cement what this forbidden science has finally brought to light, because the picture now is clear, and it demands a rewriting of the old scripts. Takeaway 1. Kurds show a dominant, unequivocal genetic link to the ancient Zagros mountain Neolithic populations. The skeleton from Wesme Cave, the farmers of Ganj Dere whose fingerprints are still impressed into the ancient clay, the herders who carved their lives into the stony valleys. These are not distant footnotes in the Kurdish story. They are the direct genetic ancestors, and no subsequent migration, not from the steppes, not from Arabia, not from Anatolia, managed to erase their biological legacy. The mountains acted as a genetic bank, and the Kurds are its account holders. Takeaway 2. The high frequency of Y-DNA haplogroup J2A, with its subclade M410, ties the Kurdish male line directly back to the first agriculturalists of the Fertile Crescent. This is not a marker of Turkic expansion, which is more closely associated with haplogroups like C and Q and certain subclades of R1A. It is not a marker of Arab expansion, which heavily features J1. It is the marker of the innovators, the men who first built granaries and baked bread, whose expansion from the Zagros and Taurus Piedmonts changed the human diet forever. Imagine the smell of that first communal baking, the taste of a world transformed. The Kurds are their descendants. Period. Takeaway 3. The Kurdish genetic structure is a stunning blend of indigenous pre-Indo-European ancestry, Iran Neolithic and Caucasus hunter-gatherer, forming the overwhelming majority of the genome, with a later but smaller layer of steppe-related ancestry that probably brought the Indo-European Kurdish language. This means the Kurds are biologically older than their own tongue, a pre-Indo-European people who adopted an Indo-European language, rather than an Indo-European people who migrated into an empty zone. This flips the linguistic argument on its head. The language is a cloak, but the body underneath is Neolithic. So here is the resolution, the new truth that can no longer be locked away in some dusty vault. The Kurds are not a modern composite. They are not scattered leftovers. They are one of the most continuous populations of the ancient Near East, a living bridge to a world before the pyramids, before chariots, before the sword. When you see Kurdish children playing in a mountain village, you are seeing the faces of the children who played there when writing was just a glimmer in Sumerian eyes. Their DNA tells a story of stubborn survival, of a stone-walled endurance that no empire could breach. The story we were told, that the Kurds had no ancient history, is revealed for what it always was, a weapon. And now, thanks to scientists who dared to look in places they were warned not to, that weapon has been shattered. The Kurds have not just reclaimed a history, they have revealed themselves to be a root of civilization itself, a living, breathing testament to the first people who built a home and called it good. The secret is out. So if this forbidden truth about the Kurdish genome shocked you, imagine what other ancient DNA secrets are still buried in museum vaults and dusty labs. Hit subscribe now and ring the bell, because we're the only channel exposing the discoveries that rewrite history books overnight, and you won't want to miss what we're dropping next. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.